Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this, the 2005 Renault R25, as driven by Fernando Alonso and Giancarlo Fisichella in the 2005 Formula One World Championship. The R25, it's a car that does not really need an introduction. It is the car which won the 2005 Formula One Constructors World Championship for Renault, and of course it is the car with which Fernando Alonso won his first of two Formula One World Drivers' Championships. He'd repeat the feat again with the team in 2006, being a double world champion back-to-back. Very cool. Fernando Alonso, of course, his Formula One career does appear to be well and truly over. It does not appear that he'll be returning to Formula One anytime soon. However, he is remembered as a double world champion and certainly one of the greatest talents that we have seen in the 21st century. The R25, well, what is it? Well, it is, of course, a Formula One car, and it's a very good one at that, winning the drivers' and constructors' titles. It was designed by Renault for the sole purpose of competing in the 2005 F1 Championship. That design effort was led by technical director Bob Bell, with chief designer Tim Densham hashing out the details and, of course, delegating to the rest of the design and construction team. The engine in the back, it is a Renault RS25 V10 engine, 72-degree bank angle on that V10. Of course, all the development work going on there under the direction of Rob White at Viry-Châtillon in France, where they do have all of their engine production and dyno testing facilities, and Renault, of course, to this day, still using their facilities in Enston and Viry-Châtillon for the development of the car. Competition history on the R25. Well, it won the World Championship. However, how did it get there? 19 races in 2005. The car started 18 of them. Quite famously, all of the Michelin-shod teams did not start the United States Grand Prix at Indianapolis on safety grounds. However, out of the 18 race starts that it made, it took 8 race victories, 7 pole positions, and 3 fastest laps. It, of course, won the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship in the hands of Fernando Alonso and Giancarlo Fisichella. Overall, Fernando Alonso did the vast majority of Renault's bidding in terms of wins, Alonso taking 7 Grand Prix victories that year, Giancarlo Fisichella winning the season opener in Australia. However, that was his final win in 2005. He would do one more race victory in his Formula One career, winning the 2006 Malaysian Grand Prix. However, Fernando Alonso definitely the star driver of this era in 2005. His main antagonist in terms of running for the World Championship was Kimi Räikkönen driving McLaren's MP420. However, as we'll talk about, it was not exactly a very nice time for McLaren or for Kimi Räikkönen in 2005. Therefore, the R25, it is the last Formula One car to win the World Championship in the glorious V10 era, and it's not a model that we see all that often anymore. This one is done by Mattel in their Hot Wheels line. It is a period model as well, so a 2005 model of a 2005 car. So some of the things on it definitely do belie its age, but it is still a very nice one, as we shall see. Let's take a closer look. Yes, the R25, the last championship winner of Formula One's V10 era. From roughly 1995 or so, all the way up to 2005. Of course, there are some outliers on either side of that timeline. Formula One was, for the most part, a V10 formula, and many of us still to this day look back upon this era as one of the most interesting, one of the most exciting, one of the most technically innovative eras in Formula One history. And this car is the last one to triumph in that glorious time of the V10 engine, the R25. The car as we see it here, driven by Fernando Alonso, who we have in the cockpit, as well as Giancarlo Fisichella for the balance of the 2005 season, and it was not the best car on the grid in terms of all-out pace. That honor went to the McLaren MP420, which we have featured in a past video. However, there is a saying in racing: if you're not going to finish, you may as well not start. And that is definitely what held true for the Renault Formula One team in 2005. Despite the MP420 being very much the faster car, very much the technically superior car in many ways, it was also very unreliable. Therefore, Renault were there to pick up the spoils whenever McLaren's day went bad, and unfortunately for Kimi Räikkönen and his championship hopes, McLaren's days more often went bad than they went good. Therefore, out of the 19 races of the 2005 season, which to date was the longest in Formula One history, Renault won 8 of them with the R25, scored 7 pole positions and 3 fastest laps. Yes, only 3 fastest laps in this car. It was not the fastest on the grid throughout the balance of the season, but that reliability, being able to finish races, bring home points, and bring home wins when your adversaries are simply down and out, that is what wins championships at the end of the day. Some interesting things also going on the R25 that we just don't see anymore in Formula One, and we didn't really see this in Formula One even in the era. This car, yes, of course, it's got the 3-liter V10, the Renault RS25. However, it's got a 72-degree bank angle on that engine, and this was something that teams experimented with all through the 90s and most of the way up through to the mid-2000s here at the end of the V10 era. The bank angle on an engine, again, it's just measuring the angle that's between the two banks of cylinders, the vertex of that angle being the crankshaft, 72 degrees on this RS25 engine. We had very commonly to see 90-degree bank angles, but Renault also had some other weird bank angles going on with their V10s. They had 110-degree engines, 111-degree engines. I believe somebody, I'm not sure if it was Renault, but I believe somebody actually made a 121-degree V10. I think that might have been Renault, but I'm not entirely sure. The idea with changing the bank angle on that engine being packaging, basically. These cars, of course, very sensitive aerodynamically, and as time has progressed, they've only become more so. So, you have an engine in the back. It is one of the largest single components in the race car, and it takes up a lot of space, therefore. However, you can sort of manipulate the physical parameters of that big steel lump in the back to try and do different things with your packaging. So if you have a narrower bank angle on your engine, you can perhaps funnel more air around the middle of the car because it's not being taken up by engine. However, if you have a narrower bank angle on the engine, you're also going to be raising the center of gravity of the engine because more of your high mass components, your pistons, your valves, your camshafts and things are going to be higher up in the engine assembly. So if you increase the bank angle, you can flatten out the profile of that engine. Think about the flat 12 blocks that Ferrari ran in the 70s, particularly through the mid and late 70s. Yes, 180-degree bank angle on that 12-cylinder engine in this case, but they did it for center of gravity. You can get all of your high-mass components in the engine down low, and the lower you have your center of gravity in a race car, the more predictable and more manageable handling is going to be. Therefore, the more drivable the car is going to be. However, you're doing it at the expense of packaging and at the expense of being able to manipulate airflow through the center and rear of the car, which, of course, if we're talking about the 70s, as Formula One design progressed, that area became absolutely critical aerodynamically, particularly when teams started to experiment with diffusers and ground effect. Of course, all of that still critical here in 2005 with the R25. So raising the height of the engine, basically, making the bank angle a little bit more acute, you raise the center of gravity of the engine, but you open up space around the engine for packaging, which is very important for aero in this era. Speaking of rear-end packaging and aerodynamics at the rear, well, here is the rear of the R25, and you can just see how much time Renault put into the design of this area of the car. Of course, the primary function, technically, of all of these areas, I mean, we can see little louvers and little gills cut all throughout the rear side of the midships bodywork here. So the primary function is to cool the engine, which it does, and we also have to exhaust hot air from the engine as well as exhaust gases from the engine, seen here with the two exhaust pipes there on either side. But also, aerodynamically, this is probably the most important single area on the car. Of course, it's very difficult to come up with a hierarchy of important areas on a Formula One car because they're all equally important. However, this area of the car is particularly sensitive because here, at speed, you want your center of pressure aerodynamically to be roughly in the middle so that you have a car that works well in high-speed corners, which is, of course, where Formula One cars do all of their bidding. So we can see what Renault have done on the rear end. We have a very conventional rear wing, as we can see here, a double main plane wing, easy for me to say, with a very severe upper flap, as we've seen on many circuits. Of course, that would be adjustable depending on where they were running. We've got a beam wing as well down here with the rear crash structure and an absolutely huge diffuser, as we, of course, would be seeing much more predominantly on cars moving toward the end of the 2000s decade. But also, you can see we have got all of these gills cut in for venting the hot air. A little bit later on, we're going to see what they did with chimneys on the rear end of this car. And of course, we're also thinking about protecting that rear suspension in this area as well, of course, because we got all of those hot exhaust gases from the engine, as well as just the hot air coming out of the radiators for the rear section of this car. So, of course, with so many things to consider, however, of course, it was a very good package. The other interesting technical thing that was going on with the R25, and it amazes me how many people still don't quite know this, the R25 ran a 6-speed gearbox. And of course you can see here the very slim packaging in this rear end. Roughly we would expect the gearbox to be around this area, but of course sitting more forward, so roughly up there. And again, when we take a look from the side, you'll be able to see that a little bit more clearly. Basically, you've got a transaxle in a Formula One car. You would have a differential roughly in the middle coming off to your two half shafts to run the rear axle, and then of course directly attached to your differential is going to be the gearbox. A 6-speed gearbox in this car, which was not at all commonplace by 2005. The only 3 cars to run with a 6-speed unit at any point during 2005 were the R25, the Minardi PS05, and the Williams FW27, believe it or not. Although Williams alternated between a 6 and 7-speed unit throughout the season, Minardi and Renault were the holdouts who exclusively ran the 6-speed gearbox for the balance of the year. Minardi, of course, a bit cash-strapped in what turned out to be their final season as a constructor, but Renault, they had developed a 7-speed unit, but they were not happy with the weight, nor were they quite happy with the reliability. And because that RS25 V10 was the best on the grid in terms of producing mid-range torque, they didn't really see the need to have a 7th ratio in the box. They were able to get off the line just fine with first gear being a little bit longer, and of course the rest of the box would have to be a bit longer as well because you don't have a 7th forward ratio, but the torque from the engine was enough to overpower the slight gearing disadvantage that they would have at many circuits, and, well, it was good enough to win the Constructors Championship. So, yes, a little bit of an Easter egg about the R25. It is one of the last 6-speed Formula One cars, and it is the last 6-speed Formula One car to win the Constructors Championship. Taking a look from the side now, and I mean, we can see that everything more or less is where you would expect to find it on these cars. However, a couple of the little idiosyncrasies of the 2005 Aero packages are evident here. First of all, take a look at the front end here. Take a look at where that front wing end fence is with the Telefonica branding on it. You can see just how high it is relative to the rest of the car. That is not a fault at all in the production of the model. It is an artifact of what the FIA did to the front-end aero treatments on these cars in 2005. 2004, we remember that season as being the fastest ever for a very long time, and on some circuits, the 2004 cars still hold official lap records. However, for 2005, amid other rule changes, particularly banning tire changes in the pit stops during the race, they also raised the minimum height of the front wing end fences here in an attempt to slow the cars down and reduce their aerodynamic efficiency. Believe it or not, there were still some concerns in this era regarding how safe some of the tracks were in terms of being able to arrest a car that had gone out of control. Cornering speeds ever higher in Formula One. Year by year, the cars get faster and faster and faster, and the circuits don't always change to match that. So the FIA, always being the voice of reason, whether we like them or not, and most of the time we don't like them at all. However, they did something right this time. Let's take away a little bit of the downforce. Let's make these cars a little bit more, shall we say, acceptable in medium and high-speed corners. So they raised the front wing end fences there. However, we'll see an implication of that. That was an unintended consequence later on. Moving rearward, though, on the car now, we can see our wheel and tire assembly there. Very cool, with our black on black motif with the wheel and the tire. Michelin tires, of course. Front suspension, the upper part of the wishbone there on the left-hand side, evident. And then we get into the barge board treatment on the R25. Compared to what we see now with barge boards and turning vanes in 2019 and now starting to see some of the 2020 cars, we can see very simplistic single element barge board, not at all dissimilar from what most of the other teams were running in this era. Still not every team running barge boards in this era. Williams on the FW27 did not run conventional barge boards like this, for example. That car, of course, was not a front runner, but it did score a pole position. So different interpretations, coming up with different solutions to the same rules package. That's one of the things that we absolutely love about Formula One. Moving rearward still, getting into the cockpit area, you can see we have got our complement of antennas and pitot arrays up top, and then we get into the cockpit area proper with our little windscreen, and of course we'll take a closer look at this later on. Coming into the side pod inlet, where, of course, we'd have a radiator inlet here, and then moving rearward, we've got ourselves our turning vanes and chimneys. Now, of course, turning vanes are things that we still see in Formula One. They're going to go away for 2021, it would appear, but we still see them now. 2019 cars are all over the place, are those turning vanes, and I'm sure they will be the same as we see more of the 2020 machinery, but you can see this little appendage here. This is not a turning vane per se, although it does have some ancillary function thereas. However, this is really a chimney. And by chimney, I mean this is an exhaust outlet, not for the engine, but for the radiators and other elements of the cooling system. Your air is going to be coming into the side pod from, obviously, the forward side. So it's going to be shot through the car like that. Basically, yes, like that. So as the air comes in through the top here, through the front of the side pod, it's going to go rearward, and then what do we do with it? We are not necessarily allowed to have big openings and cuts toward the rear side of the side pod in that area, which might be a good idea to try and feed the diffuser, but the rules, I am sure, would not quite have allowed all of that back then. And also, we've got our carbon fiber suspension elements there for the rear end, so that might not be so good to be blowing 200-300 degree air in that area, so perhaps not a good idea. So what they did was, they would have the air come in, and then they would split it inside the side pod. Some of it would continue inside the side pod, cool the exhaust a little bit, and vent here through these gills. But others would pass exclusively through the radiators, and then it would be shot out here through this slot gap, basically, through this chimney. It would come out, and then, of course, it would start to entrain itself toward the rear end. Also happening with this chimney, we see this little vane here, this little flick up, this auxiliary winglet. This is entirely trying to capture some of that high-speed flow coming out of the chimney and then add a little bit more downforce to the rear of the car. So again, very cool solutions to these problems in this era, and we still saw a lot of technical variety in Formula One in this era. This was one of those years where every car was instantly recognizable, not just because of the colors on the bodywork, but because of what the cars actually were in terms of their design with the shapes and layout of so many different things. Of course, they were very similar in many respects. They're all built to the same rules package, of course. They all ran V10 engines and things like that, but they still had the technical freedom to come up with novel solutions in many areas, and this is something that I'm afraid we are losing very quickly in modern Formula One, and it's a shame to see, but still in this era, plenty of it. Now taking a look at the front end on the R25, first of all, the obvious bits. There is our suspension, double wishbone and push rod, and it's the same on the rear, of course. This is the suspension layout that all the teams used in this era, and all the teams still, as of at least the end of the season in 2019, they were running double wishbone, push rod front suspensions. Everybody running a pull rod rear nowadays, but not the case here in 2005. Everybody was a push rod arrangement front and rear. However, we talked about that minimum height regulation for the front wing end fences in 2005. And yes, you can see that here. We can see how high relative to the ground that front wing is. However, take a look at the middle of that wing. You notice anything about it? Yes, it's much lower than the end fences. What the FIA did in their infinite wisdom was mandate a minimum height for the outboard sides of the front wings, but they said nothing about the entirety of the wing. In other words, they never envisioned that a team would do something other than make a straight across wing. So of course, Formula One designers, being very clever people, said, they didn't say that the entire wing needs to be the same height, did they? No, they did not. So what most of the teams did was they had some variation of what we started to call the spoon wing, or the spoon profile front wing. And it gets that name from that overall profile, that almost silhouette look of the leading edge of the front wing. You can see it's high on the outboard side, and then it gradually tapers down to its lowest point just underneath the nose of the car. And the reason why they would do this is the closer you can get a wing to the ground, the more efficient it's going to be. You're going to be accelerating airflow underneath the wing, and when an airflow accelerates across an adjacent surface, the relative pressure drops, and that creates a suction effect. An aircraft wing uses exactly the same idea, however, it's inverted on an aircraft, because the lower pressure air would then be on the upper side of the wing, which creates a suction, which creates a net lift force. Here on a race car, we're trying to do the exact opposite. So we want the faster air with a lower relative pressure to the adjacent surface underneath to suck the car down to create a negative down force like that. So that is why they wanted to have the middle section, at very least, of the wing as close to the ground as possible to try and get that maximum downforce effect, that maximum downward net pressure acting on the car. And it's, again, most efficiently, that happens when you can accelerate air through a very narrow slot gap almost. If the teams really had free reign, what they would have done is they would have had these wings completely encompass the front track of the car, and then they would have had them scraping the road on titanium or magnesium skid blocks. However, the FIA didn't quite allow that to happen, but they got as close as they could within the realm of the technical regulations that year. Moving away from the front wing, though, we've also got a very slender nose profile on this car, and the nose is a bit higher than what we would expect to see now on a contemporary car, but a very narrow, tapered nose coming to a point right in front, in terms of being slightly forward of that front wing, and then the front wing itself is secured to the nose via these two small and very nice curved pylons. And of course, this was a solution that we saw up and down the grid. Most of the teams in this era mounting their wings on pylons of some sort, and again, you're just trying to minimize the obstructions that the air encounters as the car runs through it. Very cool. Not every team ran this spoon wing. Of course, Renault obviously are doing it, McLaren did it, Williams did it, Sauber did it, but Ferrari did not. And what Ferrari did on their car, and I've also done a review of the F2005, they had a straight wing, much like the 2004 wing, and then they had a little ancillary cradle gantry almost of smaller winglets that were in what is the spoon section on this R25 wing. However, they did not go for a spoon profile main plane until 2006. So interesting to note there, a little bit of a design Easter egg. And again, that's what I mean when I say that we had so much diversity in design in this era. Teams came up with novel solutions, and it really did spice things up. It made it so much more interesting to study the cars and see what the designers were looking at and how they were proposing to solve all of the same problems that everybody else was looking for. Doing some freehand shooting now just to show you some more up-close details on the car. There is our front wing that we were just speaking about. There it is. You can see that we actually do have two elements separately molded in that plastic front wing. So there are two flap elements there, are basically straight and level main plane relative to angle of attack, and then the two outboard flap elements there, which actually are comprising a separate element of the wing. It's only secured on the end fences there. There's no bracing underneath the nose or anything like that. So very nice to see. Coming in close on the nose, you can see great decal work here by Mattel. Of course, Fernando Alonso running as number 5 for the balance of the season. And then, of course, we have got our complement of sponsors. There's Bibendum, the Michelin Man, of course, the Renault logo, Elf, their fuel and lubricant supplier, and all of that. Coming up across the top of the monocoque, there is the very euphemistic Team Spirit logo that we've got here on the R25. Of course, Mild 7 were the title sponsors of the team in that era, but of course, this being a model which in part is marketed to children, they didn't want any tobacco sponsorship on it, and of course the car did run with this Team Spirit livery at several events throughout the course of the 2005 season, as the world was already going crazy trying to do social engineering, telling people what not to do at their own time and such. Anyway, more sponsorship on the side of the bulkhead here, and again you can see very nicely applied decals. You can see a little bit of artifacting there from the backing of the decal. Obviously these are on the same strip, and you can just see a little bit where the border of that decal strip is, but it doesn't really detract from the appearance of the car all that much, if at all, in my humble opinion. Moving toward the cockpit area, there is Fernando Alonso in the car. His helmet design, which does very closely mimic what he actually did run that year and in 2006 as well, with his personal sponsors as well as team sponsors there emblazoned on that helmet. Moving over the top of the cockpit, there's the driver's suit with the seatbelt detail. They're just stickers. They're not actual fabric belts or anything like that, but it looks good, and you can see a little bit more on the suit as well. Very nice. We've got the Elf branding on the sides and tops of the wing mirrors here, and then of course more Team Spirit logos on the tops of the side pods. Very nicely done. Over here, underneath the snorkel, there's the cockpit headrest, Puma logo, Fernando Alonso's name, Spanish flag, and then the emergency kill switch for the marshals should the car need to be shut down on track. On the top of the roll bar there is the camera mount with the red stripe on it. That denotes that this is the number 1 car of a given team. The number 2 car would have had a black T-cam mount there in 2005, and the T car or the number 3 car running in practice sessions would have had a yellow T-cam mount there. So just a little bit of rules making that actually has changed nowadays. Very cool to see all that. Toward the rear section of the car, there's our engine cover, more Team Spirit logos, more Renault logos, more Elf logos. There are those gills that we talked about, as well as the chimneys and the little flick-ups behind the chimneys trying to take advantage of some of that exhaust flow. There is the left bank engine exhaust and the rear suspension visible there as well. There is our rear wing with the 2 main plane elements, that upper flap there, and you can very nicely see a proper slot gap as well on that wing. Very nicely done. Tire detail as well. Very cool. Very, very, very cool indeed. Now coming in from the rear so we can actually take a look into the cockpit. There it is. Not the greatest level of detail in here. However, it is in keeping with what we would expect these Mattel models from this era to be. Remember, this is a model of a 2005 car, and the model was actually produced in 2005 as well. So this was before some of the bigger names in the 1/18 scale hobby came into the market. Of course, we've always had companies like Mini Champs around for decades at this point, but they weren't quite as popular in this era. Not as many companies made 1/18, so the standards were still somewhat in doubt in terms of what one of these models should be. So we don't have little decals or anything on the sides of the bulkhead with homologation stickers or chassis plates or anything like that. We don't even have all that much detail on the steering wheel itself, if we can get our light in there. But what we do have is reasonable. I mean, the overall button configuration in there does look reminiscent of what the R25 steering wheel actually would have been. But again, it's not quite the same. The shape isn't quite right and all of that. But for what we do have in here, it's not at all bad. We do have operable steering on this car. Might be a little bit difficult to see with the lighting, but the steering does work, as you can see. Sometimes it appears to have a little bit of a mind of its own in terms of how far the wheel actually wants to turn, but there it is. It does work. We do have some reflective tape there on the rear side of the mirror as well, so technically speaking they are mirrors that do function as mirrors, although I have no idea how well they're actually sighted. rear side of the engine cover, you can see how everything tapers to this very sharp point at the rear. Basically, I suppose you could call this the beginning of the shark fins that we would ultimately see beginning in 2008, and then they really came into their own in 2010 and then later in 2017. But yeah, there it was on the R25, and several other cars had that tapered engine cover moving toward the rear for quite a few years up to this point. A little bit closer up on the diffuser as we saw earlier, and you can see we've got multiple elements going on here. We've got our reference plane, and then we've got level 1, level 2, level 3, that big central tunnel exhausting out the back, and then almost reminiscent of what Braun would later do for 2009. You can see this triangular area toward the center of the diffuser. I'm sure that Renault would have called that their starter hole. So in other words, the starter motor would go into the back of the gearbox and crank the engine over. However, they're going to have a huge aerodynamic benefit from having that big triangular open section right underneath the midline of the car. So, yes, of course, a little bit of trickery going on in this era, as there always is in Formula One design. Here's the rear wing, the interfaces of the end fences, and then we've got that beam wing, our rain light, and our rear crash structure so much less substantial than it is nowadays, or even what it would have been in 2007, so only 2 years removed from this design. The rear crash structures really were bolstered for, again, more safety, more impact strength. So yes, a little bit of an artifact of the time there as well. Upper side of the engine cover once again. There are the big gills. There are the exhaust outlets for the engine. Very nicely done. Top of the chimney there. And then, of course, our little T-wing below, the T-cam mount. Very nice. Rear side of Alonso's helmet, if we'll focus. There we go. Very cool. And again, I remember seeing all of these sponsors back in this era as well. Very, very cool. Roughly approximating the angle, at very least, from the onboard shots that we would have seen in this era. Very nice. Looks the part. Absolutely does. The shape of that monocoque is right. Definitely that looks like an R25. So all in all, I definitely have to say a fair effort from Mattel. No, it's not the best model that I have by any means, but as far as other Mattels go, this one really is not half bad. I've certainly seen worse from these guys, and this one is certainly nowhere near the worst of the worst, so definitely it's a cool one. And just lastly here, I know that some of you very much like to see the undersides of these models, so there they are. There's the front wing. The entire under tray, all the black sections, they do have that carbon fiber look to them, so you can see that there on the wing. That looks good. Down the center section of the car underneath the front end there. There's your suspension pickup points. There's the keel, which you can see we've got our lower suspension elements mounted to the keel. It's this little protrusion down the center of the car. This is something that we no longer see on Formula One cars. This is a single keel design, or a V keel design, some people call it. We would have double keels, even triple keels, and then a zero keel, which is what we have nowadays, the suspension being bonded directly into the bottom of the monocoque. But here, this is a traditional single keel design, and again, it's just to get the lower suspension elements of the front end mounted to the monocoque. They couldn't quite get the angles that they would need to make this directly bonded to the lower side of the monocoque, so they had a keel, a little protrusion coming down from the bottom of the monocoque. So cool, and again, that's a little trait that we no longer see in F1. There are the principal barge boards right here, and then the little auxiliary barge boards immediately forward of that, and you can see how they work together there in those open curving shapes. Here's the plank of the car down at the absolute bottom, and there is the reference plane, more outboard here on the bottom, manufactured under license from Renault F1 Team Limited. Hot Wheels, yes, and then of course made in China, as they are, and here you can really see that faux carbon look across the entire under tray of the car. Very cool. There it is, Renault R25, and then nothing else is written here on the bottom of the car. There is our rear end, our diffuser, very nice, and our rear wing, our beam wing, and all of that rear tire and suspension area. Very cool. So there we have it, the Renault R25 in 1/18th scale by Mattel Hot Wheels. Is it the best model ever? No, it's certainly not. However, I think we've got to judge this one by the time in which it was made. Again, this is a 2005 model of a 2005 car, and the 1/18th scale market has changed quite a bit in all of that time in the interim. So we now have the BBRs of the world and the CMCs and Auto Arts, and of course Mini Champs just continue to go from strength to strength. So these models were not the upper crust even in their era. However, because Mattel did have an exclusive license in many cases to be the only company to make models of the Formula One cars in the years that they were actually racing, something like this is basically a one-off. We don't have another example of an R25 made by another company, at least not at this point, not to the best of my knowledge. Perhaps in the years to follow, if Mini Champs can continue their World Champions line, maybe we could get an R25 by Mini Champs, and I think that would be a cool model to have. But for the time being, this is what we have if we want to have a model of an R25 in 1/18th scale. And for that, I think it has done a fine job. There are certain things on the car that could be better. I mentioned the cockpit detail. Those seat belts, they're just a sticker. They're not actual seat belts. They're not made of fabric. They don't have photo-etched buckles or anything. There are no decals going on inside the cockpit on the bulkhead. But for the most part, it is what it is. And for what it is, I think they have done a fine job, as I've said. Aerodynamically, proportionally, the shapes and sizes of all the car's major components, it looks good enough, and of course it looks accurate enough when we take a look at what the R25 actually looked like, because of course we do have a lot of video and pictures from that era. It's also really cool, on a personal note, to have a car done as a model that we also have in sim racing. Of course, VRC, with their wonderful Assetto Corsa work, we have the R25 drivable in Assetto Corsa, and it's one of my favorite cars to drive in all of sim racing. They did a great job on their Assetto Corsa version of the car, so it's really cool to be able to make that connection as well between sim racing and reality, to have a tangible object that you can actually pick up and manipulate. So again, I like that connection as well. But all in all, that's the R25. Do let me know what you think about it. Do let me know if there's anything that I could tell you about that perhaps I've overlooked. But definitely, I like this one. Glad to have it. And certainly, if you could find one available on everybody's favorite internet auction site, do take a look. You won't be disappointed. It is mid-2000s Mattel. But again, if you know what you're getting into, it's going to be a fine acquisition for you. I do hope that all of you enjoyed this one. Until next time, though, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you all very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.